Hello and welcome to the Whirly Bloke channel. Today I'll be showing you the results from 3 months use and testing of the Caddx Tarsier 4K dual sensor HD and FPV camera. I've had 3 Tarsier cameras now. I bought one when it first came out and put it in my Impulse RC Reverb, which is all bits actually. And the others have been in this Eachine Cinecan 4K and the Gep RC Cine Pro 4K. So after a few months of use of a few cameras and some testing, I finally reached a conclusion about this camera. Now, when Caddx first announced the Tarsier way back in May this year, I pre-ordered one immediately. I've always had an issue with the split type cameras. The sensor is shared between the analog and the digital system, so there's always a technical trade-off and a compromise of setup. And the Caddx Turtle and the Runcam Split technically always seem to favour the HD use, and the FPV experience isn't as good as with a dedicated FPV camera. And when you change the camera settings to suit FPV, the HD footage is affected as well, and the two have got completely different requirements. So using a dual sensor, like the Tarsier, looks like an ideal solution. And in many ways it is, but it's not perfect. It's also got some quirks that are typical of a first generation product. So I set about capturing footage using this Gep RC Cine Pro 4K with various settings to try and fathom out how well it worked and what the best setup was. This has taken quite a while, and I've included all my test results in this video, and I've tried to be as logical as possible so I don't miss anything. Now, there's lots of footage in here for most of the available settings on the Tarsier, and I put links in the description so you can jump about and look at the bits you want to. I've come to my own conclusions that I will talk about at the end, but I'll leave you to review the footage and decide for yourself. And I'll show you some tips, gotchas and recommendations on using the Tarsier. And remember that some of this is 4K and some is at 120 frames a second. So YouTube doesn't give you the full story because it compresses everything in its own particular way. But if you're planning to use your HD footage on YouTube, then the result will be pretty much the same as it is here. So before we start, a quick reminder of the Tarsier spec. The bottom sensor here is the FPV camera that's 4x3, and it's got a field of view of 165 degrees. And the top sensor offers various resolutions, aspect ratios and bit rates. But it's basically a fixed aperture f2.8 4K sensor, and it's got a 150 degree view. You configure the FPV camera with a joystick dongle plugged into the Tarsier in this dongle port here, and you adjust the HD camera using the Caddx app that connects to the camera with Wi-Fi. You can see there's a little aerial there. You can use the button on the board, this front one here, but it's really hard work and just so fiddly. The Tarsier gives you 4K at 30 frames a second at 16:9 aspect ratio, 2.7K at 60 frames a second, that's 4:3, 1.4K at 60 frames a second, again at 4:3, and you've got 1080p up to 90 frames a second at 16:9. And if you really want it, you've got 720p at 120 frames per second, and again, that's 16:9. So the aspect ratio changes with the resolution, and you can choose between high, medium and low bit rates, and that equates to 70, 50 and 30 megabits per second. The higher the bit rate, the more detail you'll capture, but you will need more storage space on your SD card, and it needs to be a fast SD card. So here's some general flying around showing the FPV and the HD footage combined, so you can see the relative field of view. If I pause it here, you can see the FPV field of view is wider, and I deliberately chose an HD setting that was 16:9, and this one was with a Caddx N8 ND filter on both cameras. And here's the same thing but without the ND filter, and I prefer to use this with the ND filter on both cameras, if I'm honest. The FPV footage seems to just have a better dynamic range when it's viewed in the goggles, but that may just be me. So let's get started. This is 4K 30 frames a second at the low bit rate, and all of these are with the N8 ND filter on. You can see here we've got 16:9 aspect ratio. Okay, we're taking the bit rate up to 50 megabits per second, which is medium bit rate, and you're getting slightly better colour and a little bit more detail. And this is at the high bit rate. Again, nicer colours, a bit more detail in the grasp as you're flying over it. So now we switch to 2.7K, 60 frames a second, and this is the low bit rate. And this is 16:9. More of that later. Going up to the medium bit rate at 60 frames a second. Again, a little bit more detail. And here we are on 2.7K, 60 frames a second at the high bit rate, which is 70 megabits per second. Colours are quite nice, and there doesn't seem to be too many blocks or artifacts. Again, this looks like it's 16:9. So here we are on 1.4K, 60 frames a second at the low bit rate, and you can see here this is definitely 4:3. Now we're on 1.4K, 60 frames a second at the medium bit rate. Again, this is 4:3. And now we're up to the high bit rate on 1.4K, 60 frames a second. Again, you can see that this is a 4:3 aspect ratio. Right, so we're now on 1.4K at 30 frames a second, and this is at the low bit rate. I don't think this is an option I'd particularly use. Okay, so now same thing at the medium bit rate. The colours seem to be pretty good on 50 megabits per second, it's quite nice. Again, this is 4:3. And last for this resolution, we're on the high bit rate, 1.4K 30 frames a second. And this is quite nice and undistorted. I quite like this. It's just weird seeing it 4:3. Right, so we're now on 1080p at 90 frames a second, a bit difficult to tell on YouTube, and this is at the medium bit rate. And you can see here, this is 16:9. Looks like I've got fed up standing up as well. And this is at the high bit rate. I didn't bother with the low bit rate for this. Again at 90 frames a second, 1080p. And this is definitely 16:9. Unstretched. So we're on 60 frames per second on 1080p at the medium bit rate. Decided to sit down now, it's getting too hot. And I can't fly sitting down, as you can see. Okay, this is on 60 frames per second at the high bit rate 1080p. You bored yet? I haven't included every single combination, just the major ones I know will give me the footage that we all want. I don't have any real need for 720 at 120 frames per second. Yeah, I could use it to make slow-mo stuff, but the quality wouldn't be that great. And if I'm honest, I just got bored flying laps and changing settings, and I ran out of lipos. But have you noticed the weirdness yet? The 4K 30 frames per second at the high bit rate is the best quality 16:9 footage. But as expected, you get blurry and blocky artifacts. It's great when the camera's stationary or you're flying really slow, but otherwise it's not up to using something like a GoPro Hero 7 or Session 5. So the 2.7K at 60 frames a second high bit rate looks like a good option, and the spec says that's 4:3, but you can see here clearly it's 16:9. But if you take a closer look, it's actually 4:3 that's been stretched to 16:9. Have a look at these stationary shots and you'll see what I mean. This is 4K and you can see that this is 16:9. It's a bit fisheye, but it's 16:9. Now if we switch over to 2.7K, there you can see it's fairly obvious. This is 16:9, but it's actually 4:3 that's been stretched and it looks weird. Okay, so this is 1.4K and you can see that's definitely 4:3 aspect ratio, and we're on 1080p now. This is 16:9. Last one we're on 720p and it's a low resolution, but it's 16:9. In this case the stretch and distortion is obvious, but with moving footage and just fields and trees it's not so obvious. If you're going to fly around buildings then you'll see it. So after 3 months use I now tend to use just two of these settings. 4K at 30 frames per second for the slow flow cine whoop style flying, and the 2.7K at 60 frames a second for general acro flying. And this is all at the high bit rate of 70 megabits per second. The 4K can look a bit blocky when you fly fast, and the 2.7K is better quality than using something like a Caddx Turtle or a Runcam split at 1080p. But the advantage of having dual sensors that can be set up independently is a massive bonus. The downside is each camera is the same angle, and the framing of the HD camera on the top will be at a slightly higher angle than the FPV camera on the bottom, because their positions and fields of view are different. That means close framing, when you're close up, will look different for each camera, and you can end up with the HD footage that's looking up much higher than what you see in the goggles. Anyway, these are my conclusions, so review the footage, don't get too bored, and decide for yourself. And now we come to the bit rate. This simply means the density of data and ultimately the granularity of the footage. To my mind, just select the highest bit rate, 70 megabits per second, and use a fast U3 SD card that's at least 32 gig. I tend to use a minimum of 64 gig cards. Again, check the test footage to see the difference. It's not massive, but it is noticeable, particularly when you're moving fast. Lower bit rates tend to look more blocky, especially when you're moving over grass and concrete and that sort of thing. Now, the format on these SD cards is very finicky. They need to be FAT32 with a 64K block size. This is a bit unusual, and you can't use the app to format these SD cards. If you don't format them with exactly these settings, it won't recognize the card and it won't record. But 32 gig is the maximum partition or card size for FAT32, so you won't be able to format anything bigger than 32 gig with your PC or your Mac. So if you just grab a copy of GUI format and you can use that. It's a free download for Windows, and you just select a block size of 65536, which is 64K, and then hit format, and it just formats it really quickly. If there's an error, like it says the SD card's already in use with something like Explorer, take care, because the block size will default back to 32K and you need it to be 64K. Now, when I originally reviewed this as part of the eSheen CineCam review, this guy here, I suggested that the ND filter on the FPV was a complete waste of time. But I use it all the time now because the FPV view just looks better. Also, the HD camera really benefits from having the filter. You get all the usual ND filter benefits. It significantly reduces jello, and the CineCam is quite jello-y. It's got quite a bit of wobble on it. Putting the ND filter on gets rid of most of that. And it protects the lens, of course, but take care. If you crash, it's liable to come off, and finding it in the grass is really annoying. I lost one, but the good news is they're only a few dollars direct from Caddx. Got another one here. I've ordered a few bits and pieces direct from the Caddx website, and they arrived within 5 days, which is pretty impressive for the UK. Another option is choice of codec, H.264 or H.265. Although H.265 is a more efficient compression and results in smaller files on your SD card for the same quality of image, I really recommend just using H.264. Why? Well, the problem comes when you start trying to edit the footage. H.265 needs a beefier computer to handle the decompression and processing, and you'll probably have to resort to proxy files, edit those, and then do a final render using your EDL. Final Cut Pro handles all this for you, and I assume Premiere Pro will as well, but the net result is a more fiddly and time-consuming post-production workflow. You mainly just get much longer render times. Just stick to H.264. The quality of this footage really doesn't warrant all that kerfuffle. Now, if there's a suitably formatted SD card in the DVR, the Tarsier will start recording when it powers up. Let's get this powered on. There we go, we've got a green light there and it's flashing. Now, this light is on the same side as the buttons. Now that's flashing, that indicates it's recording. And this is great because it means it starts recording when you plug the quad battery in. And you can see the light just flashes away there. So if you want to change the camera settings using the Caddx app, you need to turn the Wi-Fi on. And what you need to do is long press this back button here for about 5 seconds to turn it on. But it won't turn on if it's recording. So if this LED is flashing like that, then it means it's recording. So to stop that, just short press this back button once. There we go. It's gone solid, which means that it stopped recording. Now, it took me a while to fathom this. If you now long press the back button, this multifunction button here, I'm going to press it. And eventually that light comes on and it flashes. And that tells you that it's ready to be connected. So if we now connect to this with our app. So this LED this on this side here is the Wi-Fi LED. And it's now gone solid because it's actually talking to the Wi-Fi on this iPad. You can see we've got some images there. And you can then go in and change all your settings, just do what you like, that's all good. And when you're done changing the settings, just short press the same button and that will turn the Wi-Fi off and start recording because there's an SD card in there. And if you want to stop recording, again, just short press back button and that LED is stopped. Do remember to press stop when you've landed. Don't just unplug the battery. It's supposed to handle this, but I found it's a bit unreliable. If you just hit the button once, like that, LED goes solid and it stops recording, and when you land it works 100% of the time. You don't get any small files on here or broken files. Another gotcha is when you fly until the battery voltage is really low, the DVR board will auto power off and the recording sometimes ends up as a 0-byte file, and that just isn't playable. Also, the colour of the record LED will change depending on the resolution that you got selected. You can switch the settings without using the app if you want, using this button here, the middle button, but it's a bit fiddly. So if the red indicates 4K, if I hit that, it's gone green, which indicates 2.7, and we've got blue, which is 1.4. This sort of light mixed green red colour is 1080p, and then this colour is, I think, 720, I can't remember. It's difficult to interpret, much easier to just use the app. But at least you know when you start recording, so I know that if I start recording now, if I set that up using the app, red I think indicates 4K. So after all that stuff, what can we conclude? Well, this isn't a GoPro Hero or a Session, so don't expect the same quality. But don't get me wrong, it's not bad, it's just not up to the same HD level as a GoPro, even though it's spec'd at 4K. The 1080p footage isn't quite as good as the Turtle or the Split either, but the 2.7K is better, so it's worth it for that. And the big benefit is that you can independently set up the FPV camera and the HD camera without one compromising the other. And that's what really bugs me about the split type cameras. Now, after 3 months use, I really like the Tarsier, and now I understand what it's doing and can choose the right setting for each type of flying that I do. It's definitely better than the split solution, but is it the future? Well, DJI accepted, I think it is, and I'm really keen to see what version 2 brings. I think the sensor in here does need some work, and it feels like firmware changes will fix the aspect ratio and SD card formatting issues. And given the speed that things are happening at Caddx at the moment, that can't be long coming. So for now though, this is my choice of camera for cine whoops and sub 3-inch quads that simply can't carry a Hero or a Session, and you want HD footage and a DVR. Basically, it's anything that's under 250 grams. As always, thanks for watching, and if you found that useful, give me a thumbs up and leave a comment, and if it's your first visit, then please consider subscribing to the channel for updates. I'll see you next time.